Everybody, it's the Mad Master here. I'm just doing a quick video while I continue my progress in making my apartment presentable for a inspection, which I pass muster. It's becoming kind of a cliche that I'm mentioning this in videos while doing videos. But anyways, this one is about the alternative rockers, much like my previous video that might be up by now, but it might be after this one, who knows, that proclaimed, and I'm actually going to do a project on this about metal in the 90s. I'm going to be actually seeking out people to do this project with me, possibly in the next few weeks or something. There's a project, I have this idea for this project, and I'm not going to go too much into it, but it's, you know, documenting a lot of what happened in the 90s. But anyways, so the other day I was watching this Anthrax documentary on their YouTube. Not Anthrax, the bioweapon Anthrax, but the band Anthrax. So I was watching this Anthrax thing, and okay, you know, they had I think they had Chuck D on it, and you know, Vernon Reid of Living Colour, and some other people, and you know, some contemporaries in the New York, you know, scene that, you know, it's one thing like having Vernon Reid on there, who was kind of borderline between metal and alternative, you know, in the 90s. Like Living Colour, their second album has a lot more of aggressive stuff, like more thrashy kind of stuff. Kind of like, you know, what happened, like the first album was more conventional, even though it was pretty different, but it was more conventional, had a more conventional kind of, you could tell it was made in the 80s with the drums and stuff. But the second album, they kind of went a leap forward, kind of like Skid Row, you know, they got more aggressive and stuff, did some more eclectic kind of stuff on the second album, because, you know, like you have the first Skid Row album, for example, and it's more conventional and stuff, even though it's good, like just like the first Living Colour is good. But point being is that Living Colour probably had their metal bona fides, was still solidly in place. They didn't they were more alternative to some extent in some ways, but they didn't go out there and say, oh, metal sucks, you know. But then I see someone very curiously in the documentary, who I did not expect, and I was like, who I was, you know, don't get me wrong, I've been a fan for a long time, probably since I was about 12 years old. I was a fan, and the fact of the matter is that it's just weird seeing him in this documentary, and that's Henry Rollins. And Henry Rollins has had a long history of, you know, bashing metal. You know, even in his book, he made fun of Venom, who undoubtedly was an influence on Anthrax, just like all the new wave of British heavy metal bands were on all the thrash bands. Bashes Venom in his book, Get in the Van, one of his books, not his book, he had a lot of books, has a lot of books, but he used to make fun of Iron Maiden. I mean, in his stand-up, I'll use that but I heard other stuff. I read stuff in the 90s, from the 90s. I'm not that old. I was born in the 90s. No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, right. You know, I've read from the 90s. It wasn't in the 90s. I wasn't in the 90s when I read it. No, I wish I could say that. But where he was interviewed for these magazines, I was like, he's like, there was one in particular that really pissed me off, and I'm going to try to find it. I'm trying to find all these old interviews for this project I'm doing anyways, where he's basically saying Rollins band isn't like we don't use blow up dolls on stage like Iron Maiden, because we have good music and we're not all about the show, you know, blah blah blah. And it's like, now he's doing these like Anthrax and Slayer documentaries and shit, and like saying, it's just like this revisionism amongst the alternative Generation X alternative rock stars. Like, I mean, Tom Morello, to be fair, okay, so I was listening to this Tom Morello interview from the 90s, and he kind of was straddling the fence, because he's like, oh yeah, I grew up listening to bands like Kiss and Judas Priest or whatever, and now I'm, you know, but now what I wanted to do with this, like, now he's more like Tom Morello was straddling the fence. Henry Rollins was outright hostile in the 90s to metal. and to you know, bands, and they were considered alternative metal. They were kind of a heavier band. Now in the 80s, he liked to troll punk fans too, though, like, you know, with his whole thing playing ZZ Top, like on like punk, like underground punk radio stations, like say, like putting in a tape and say this is the, or maybe for some punks that were dumb in England or something. Once he put in a ZZ Top tape, he's like, this is a new band that's from America, it's a punk band and shit like that, and he liked Van Halen and stuff, but he would always also bash a lot of metal. And, you know, he's been in a lot of documentaries about the death of, you know, Nirvana killed metal and like how great it was and all this stuff. So it's like, for him to come out now and like say that he was like part of, almost like acting like he was part of the scene that Anthrax is from, it's just fucking moronically revisionist bullshit. And I see this from a lot of these guys. Like, it started in the early 2000s, you know, with the what was it called? Probot album that Dave Grohl did, which I think I had a lot of problems with. I thought it was cool he was getting out all these old singers from the 80s that were still doing stuff, by the way, too, like King Diamond and Kronos and, you know, others like that, Lemmy, Wino, and all these people, you know what I mean? So it's cool he was doing this, but it's like, where were you in the 90s when all these bands, guys were doing stuff? You weren't coming out in support. And, you know, speaking of that, I think Rollins did support Wino's band, The Obsessed, in the 90s. Like, he helped them get signed and stuff. So, like, it's not like Rollins is totally, like all metal was anathema to him, but I'm talking about particularly, like, 80s metal and, like, bands like, you know, just bands that were coming around at that time. It's like, they had this cutoff point, like the early 80s or the late 70s, and I think The Obsessed was so into Sabbath that he's like, oh, I love Sabbath, so, you know. But he was in Washington, they were in Washington, D.C. as well, but point being is that there were a lot of these guys, and someone told me a couple weeks ago that Billy Corgan, like, sort of lied about some of the gear he was using in the early 90s, because, like, he was one of the popular preamps, the 80A MP1, I guess, on some early Smashing Pumpkins. Now he's more open about, like, oh, I like the Scorpions and Kiss and Iron Maiden and all this, and UFO and all this stuff. Like, I think he covered UFO in that Spun movie or whatever. But, like, it's like, or sort of did like an acoustic cover of Love to Love, I believe, if I recall correctly. But it's like this, like, European metal, 80s metal, like, revisionism, like, oh, well, back then, if you read an interview with them, they're totally openly hostile to, you know, like, oh, we don't like those guitar solos too much, and blah, 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 and, like, fucking, like, oh, like the blow-up doll thing, like, with Iron Maiden's, like, yeah, they use a blow-up doll called Eddie, like, one blow-up doll. It's like, it's so stupid. And if I could track down that interview, I will, but it's like, and then, you know, like, even Glenn fucking Danzig, you know, you listen to the first Danzig album, and you listen to the song Am I Demon, and one of the first things I thought is, this is Dissident Aggressor, right? So, come to be the late 90s, he's doing interviews, he's like, yeah, I don't like John Christ's guitar playing that much. It was too stiff, too metal. And it's like, the irony is he goes with this guy, Tommy Victor, is even more stiff and, like, uses solid state amps as literally, like, block fucking distortion or whatever you call it. It's not a, you know, the distortion is totally, like, one monotone distortion with solid state amps a lot of the time. It's not as many dynamics as with a tube amp. And, you know, it sounds way more metal than anything. Now he's like, oh, I'm metal, you know. It's like, but he bashed people for listening, like, band members for listening to Judas Priest and Iron Maiden. And it's like, Am I Demon sounds just like Dissident Aggressor, and a lot of that album has, like, a very AC/DC and even, like, a little bit of early Priest in there, you know, you can hear it. So it's just full of shit. And, you know, these guys just, like, and then he later did the Blackest of the Black tour and stuff, and, like, half those bands were obsessed with Iron Maiden and Priest that were on that tour. Maybe they were black metal or whatever, but they were, you know, really into that stuff. So this snobbery of these musicians from the 90s, and even Glenn Danzig, who was outwardly metal, there's no doubt about that. He called himself metal, but he bashed certain elements of metal even back then. And, you know, I mean, he was punk, but then he was metal, you know what I mean? But, like, the crossover years, that was an interesting time. You know, like, that was my favorite time because, like, when like 86 through 89, like when the bands that were hardcore punk were like saying, yeah, we like metal, come to our shows, you know. That was a way better time than the 90s where they're like, fuck metal, man, we're alternative rock, we're not metal, we're gonna cut our hair. Lars Ulrich saying, we're not metal, we're hard rock, even though metal's on our name, but I'm not gonna say that, you know. Or Rob Halford infamously saying, metal is dead. It's like, fuck you, you know. You're so it's just this weird like snobbery, and I'm trying to figure out what psychological reasoning there was for it. And I guess, you know, the hair metal bands, like I heard Trickster on the radio yesterday. I was like, you know, and no offense if you people that like that, but it was like, yeah, this is, I can see how this shit got old, right? And I remember back then watching Headbangers Ball, you know, just cringing half the night. I mean, it was fun, don't get me wrong, seeing Ricky Rackman like passively aggressively like sneered at interviewees and stuff, like in this like subtle way. Like some really bad third-rate hair metal band would come on and he's like, so what is this new album about? What's this, you know? He would just do these little subtle like mannerisms and stuff. It was hilarious. And some of the videos weren't that bad either, but you know, you wade through all this shit for a Voivod video at the end of the fucking show, you know what I mean? Or Napalm Death or something. So it was like it's like one of those things. But that's what really bothers me about the 90s, is it's just and these guys that had this attitude. And it's just like Perry Farrell, like I mentioned in this previous video, or if this one, unless this one goes up first, like Perry Farrell talking about like, I didn't want Metallica, and he like lobbied to not have Metallica on Lollapalooza, like what, in '94 I think they went on there. He's like, I didn't understand back then about metal, or it's like, what is there to understand? Your fucking guitar player was in metal bands before he joined Jane's Addiction, and he liked thrash and stuff, he said, you know. But like, yet you don't understand metal. It's like, but now I understand Metallica. It's like, what a fucking douchebag, you know. And I understand Metallica less now with what they're doing, because they talk about backtracking on their whole thing, you know. Oh, load, you know, reload, and then Saint Anger is like halfway between, and then fucking, you know, then they're like donning the battle jackets all of a sudden at 50 years old, you know, with James, and you know, this, like, I mean, I didn't get a battle jacket until like last year, but I wanted one as a kid, but you know, it's like, it's just so dumb. It's just like, be consistent with your fucking, you know, your values. Who cares? You know, it's like, I mean, people bash like bands like AC/DC and stuff, but it's like, they don't give a shit. They're just like, we're who we are. We like what we like. And even Iron Maiden to some extent. It's like Steve Harris is like, he likes his stuff. He still talks about, you know, his favorite album's Foxtrot by Genesis, and that's like fucking 50 years old now almost. You know, it's like, who cares what you like or what you listen to? Like, trying to be cool and trying to be fashionable and all this stuff, and trying to be like, and then now you're jumping on this bandwagon that metal is cool again. I mean, for the last 15 years it's been cool again, I guess. You know, early 2000s it was starting to turn over, you know, that's what happened. But these alternative rockers that have been in denial that they liked metal at one time, and they would secretly, like, you know, they would secretly play their metal cassettes on tour, you know, with their fucking with the Pixies or whatever, you know, like in the back of the van or back of the bus they'll have this secret stash of Iron Maiden tapes or some shit, you know. It's just like, it's so disgustingly fucking farcical bullshit, like, oh my god. And yeah, seeing Henry Rollins was insulting in the Anthrax thing. And, you know, in a Black Sabbath documentary, you know, that's expected. Black Flag were really influenced by Black Sabbath, and you know, even Rollins' band were. But it's like, and I like both. I love both. I grew up with a black. I mean, there's half my pictures as a teenager I'm wearing a Black Flag shirt in that I still have. I don't have the shirt, I mean, but I did rebuy one of the shirts that I used to have too. But like half. I mean, I loved Black Flag, I loved Black Sabbath, but I also liked Judas Priest. I'm sorry, I liked fucking, I mean, I don't think was I into Dio? I think I was, you know, I liked all that stuff, you know. It's just like, but I didn't like deny that I liked it because it's Dungeons and Dragons, or like, you know, are too wanky with the guitar solos and cock rock. Like a lot of girls in the night, women, goth girls in the 90s used to call any metal cock rock, no matter what. Like, just like cock rock is a specific term for sexually explicit rock, right? Metallica was called cock rock by some of these people that I remember, these infamous goth girls around this town. But anyways, that's about all.